Hey everyone, Kevin P. McAuliffe here, and I am back again with another Let's Edit with Avid Media Composer tutorial. And in this lesson, it's time to get a little bit nitty-gritty. Up until this point, we've sort of looked at things with rose-colored glasses. And what I mean by that is we've made some basic assumptions that the footage that we're bringing in is going to be matching our raster dimension of our project, matching our aspect ratio of 1920 by 1080, 16 by 9. However, we know that that's rarely ever the case. We're really dealing with the wild west of footage out there. You're talking about 4K, UHD, 8K, 2398, 40 frames. To be honest, it's a lot to wrap your head around. And there are many things that you need to consider once you've linked to your footage before you even get in and consolidate and transcode. So in this lesson, what I want to do is I want to have the first of a three-part little arc of tutorials that are going to focus on our footage. What is happening with this footage when we bring it in? What is the deal with its aspect ratio, its raster dimensions? How are we going to compensate for that when working in a 16 by 9 timeline? So by the time we're done this little arc of tutorials, let me tell you something. You're going to be the expert of Media Composer footage and how to bring it in and how to interpret it and work with it in your timelines. Now, with that said, as always, please, if you like this tutorial, please hit that like, subscribe, and share this tutorial across social media. These concepts we're talking about here are really important core concepts of Media Composer and understanding workflow when it comes to doing things, and I'm not going to put in quotes in the right way, but really how to get your footage to look the best that it can, to look correct inside of your Media Composer timelines. And last but certainly not least, I do want to mention that I do offer one-on-one training if you think that you or your team might need it. You can always send me an email, kevinpmcauliffe@gmail.com. I am more than happy to jump online. I record all of the one-on-one training that I do to provide it to you after the fact so that you have it as a reference. If you ever need to go back and take a look at things, you'll always have that one-on-one training available to you if you need it. All right, now one thing I want to do before we get rolling is I always like to answer a little bit of Q&A if I can of some questions that have come up from the previous lessons, and I'm going to try to do that as questions pop up in the comments section below these tutorials. And the first one comes from Creative Spark AI. Creative Spark says, really great lesson, lots of little details to understand about media types. After I did my transcode, the file went from 1 gig to 21 gigs. Is that normal? It also kept the link file. At this point, could I just remove the link file right? So sort of a two-part question. Okay, so let's talk about the first part of it first. The file went from 1 gig to 21 gigs. Well, I always like to describe it like this. Okay, if you have a VHS tape and you put it onto a Blu-ray, what you basically have is this VHS tape that's super low quality on this super high quality 50 gigabit now Blu-ray. So you've basically gone from VHS quality to Blu-ray, but not necessarily Blu-ray quality. The same concept works here. You might have an MP4 file that's 32 megabytes big, all right? But when you bring it into Media Composer and you transcode it at a quote-unquote standard quality codec, the codec is just that. It's not like it's variable bit rate. It's like DNX 175 megabits per second. So to say that the file went from 1 gig to 21 gigs is, I would say, completely normal. What's now important to keep in mind is that 1 gig MP4 that's variable bitrate may have had issues playing back in Media Composer if you link to it, but now that it's been transcoded and it's now a constant bitrate, it's Avid managed media that's living in the Avid Media Files folder, you're not going to have any problems playing that media back when you hit play in the timeline. Second part of that question is, can I just remove the link file? I will say if you never plan on going back to that file to relink or anything like that, yes, you can delete it. If you plan on relinking to that file to do a high-res version of your timeline, then I would say stick it in a bin called linked files. Otherwise, yes, you can delete that linked clip. All right, we're going to talk about relinking in its own dedicated lesson only because the concept of relinking has been something that's always been exceptionally problematic for Media Composer editors. But like I said, we will talk about that in its own dedicated lesson. All right, so next question. The next question is from Deep Travel. Thanks for answering my questions. That was kind of you. I do have a new question. Can I work ProRes RAW in Media Composer? I've looked into the Avid website and haven't found an answer. Thanks. Well, Deep Travel, I will say this. You can work with ProRes RAW inside of Media Composer. However, you do not have any flexibility when it comes to adjusting any of the raw parameters of ProRes RAW because Apple has not opened up the SDK to any other company out there except for including it inside of Final Cut Pro. All right, so can you work with it? Yes. Can you adjust any of the parameters? No. Do I recommend working with it if you don't have a choice? Absolutely. When it comes to finishing, you'd have to look at an application like Scratch where they've really developed, I think, really the only workflow outside of an Apple workflow that supports getting in and adjusting some of the raw parameters of ProRes RAW. All right. And let's take a look at our last question for today. Our last question comes from the Spin Doc. 2 questions. Is basically YCBRCR 709 the default color space, so to speak? I understand what you're getting at. I'm used to working in Rec 709 in Resolve as a concept of the internet's default color space for video, but I haven't actually needed to select it there in projects. What I like to say is this: if you've shot in a compressed format 422, 420 and you're delivering compressed, YCBCR 709 is what you're going to pick as far as your project goes. And if you're working in an uncompressed 444 workflow, that's where you will pick RGB in your project setup. That's when you would choose one over the other. One's a compressed workflow, one's an uncompressed workflow. You mentioned in lesson 2 that we need to choose the export resolution frame rate. So if I decide to work on a 1080p 2997, which is my usual working settings, I work alone, so it's just arbitrary. And in just import 2397 media, I will not get an error. Do you want to change the project settings like in Resolve? That is true. What is important to keep in mind is that always choose how you want to output. If you know you're going to the web, chances are it's going to be a progressive output. Okay? What I always say is once you choose the project setting and how you're going to output, you can easily conform every other type of raster dimension, frame rate to that specific project. And don't worry about it. We're going to be going into depth in that in time. To be honest, I don't want to jump ahead too far, but yes, once you pick that output format, you'll never be asked, what do you want to do? Do you want to change this? Do you want to change that? Media Composer is just going to do what it thinks it needs to do to make the changes to make that clip work in your timeline. Okay? All right, enough questions for this week. Let's now jump into Media Composer and let's get started. All right, so we are in Avid Media Composer and we do have the clip that we were working with in our previous lesson, but you will notice that it is not consolidated or transcoded. It is simply linked to. Now what I've done is I've given us a little bit more information about what's going on with this clip because the last lesson was sort of done with rose-colored glasses because basically what I'm giving you is in the ideal world. All right, the ideal world being you're going to be dealing with footage that's 1920 by 1080, that's the raster dimension, okay, with an aspect ratio of 16:9. That is the aspect ratio and the raster dimension of the project that we're working in, so everything is great, bring it in, start working. However, as we know, we don't live in that world. All right, we live in a world where people refer to UHD as 4K and 4K as UHD. We live in a world where we're dealing with many different aspect ratios of 4K, many different aspect ratios of 8K. We've got this, we got that, we got the other. There's so much different footage happening that our heads explode. All right, it's too much. So this is where we have to sit back and we have to say, okay, let's now take a look at what exactly is going on with the clip, what we need to do to set it up properly to work within our timelines, or set it up properly to work in the transcode and consolidate window. All right. This clip here, 1920 by 1080, 16:9, matches my timeline. It's ready to consolidate or transcode. As we know, ProRes is an Avid-friendly codec. We could consolidate this clip if we wanted to, have it rewrapped, and be all set to go. Now, what's important to keep in mind is that if I right-click on this clip, I head back to consolidate and transcode. When we were talking about transcoding, I actually skipped over a couple options down here, which is to apply source transformations, color encoding, but more specifically for our lesson, FrameFlex. And the question is, why did I skip over them? I skipped over them because they need to have a lot more in-depth discussion that we're going to start with in this lesson talking about FrameFlex. Then we're going to move on in the next lesson, talk about color encoding. And then what I'm going to do is in the lesson after that, I'm going to show you what would be the workflow for larger than HD footage in your timeline. Now, in an ideal world, again, if you're shooting all your own stuff, editing all your own stuff, a lot of the stuff I'm going to show you is once you do it the first time, it's going to become like muscle memory, and then it's like a set it and forget it type of thing. But if you're working on something like a documentary where you've got all kinds of footage from all kinds of sources, 8K, 4K, HD, vertical video, doesn't matter. This is where you may need to get in and consider things on a shot-by-shot basis, all right? So let me cancel this. Let me actually delete this clip. Let me head back to the desktop because I downloaded a whole bunch of footage for us to work with. I'm going to Option or Alt drag this in to do a quick link. And the reason that I set the bin up like this was so that you could see not only the video codec that's being used, but also the raster dimension of the footage, and more specifically the image's aspect ratio. Now, what is important to keep in mind is that when you take a clip in Media Composer, by default, you drop it into a timeline, it's going to make that clip conform to what the timeline is. If the frame rate is different, it will conform the frame rate. If the aspect ratio is different, it will conform the aspect ratio as well as the raster dimensions. So basically, if you've got a, just use this clip here as an example, an 8192 by 4320p clip that's at a 1.90 to 1 aspect ratio, it's going to crush it down to match the aspect ratio and the raster dimension of our timeline, which is 1920 by 1080. Okay, so this is why you now need to consider what is happening to each clip that you're going to drop into your timeline. Okay. Now, I don't really need to deal with the 16:9 clips, so I'm actually going to remove them just because they match our timeline. And really, I don't have to consider what's going to be happening now when it comes to FrameFlex when dealing with 16:9 shots because they are the same aspect ratio of my timeline. All right, let's deal with these ones here. Now, they all happen to be 1.90 to 1. I've got some mountain biking, which is cool. Again, this is all footage that I downloaded for free from the Red website. So if you guys want to download it and try along, oh, I like kangaroos. You can download this footage and work with it as well. Now, what's great about it is that it is actually all the same aspect ratio, except for the ProRes RAW clip, which, to be honest, I don't really care about the ProRes RAW clip. Let's just delete it. Okay. And let's deal with this 1.90 to 1 aspect ratio that we have going on here, okay? So I said before that with all of these different raster dimensions and the aspect ratio, when I take them and drop them into a 1920 by 1080, 16:9 timeline, everything gets crushed down to basically fit that raster dimension, which means that your footage is going to be either squashed, stretched, who knows what's going to happen, okay? So it's important for us to know what's going to happen. So I'm going to look at this on a single shot basis first. I'm going to show you how we can do this because it looks like, you know, we could just hypothetically say this was all shot from the same camera. Okay. So I'm going to right click on this clip and I'm going to navigate up to the source settings. Now, to be honest, I kind of wish source settings and consolidate transcode were put beside each other because they so go hand in hand together. But the source settings are basically something you're going to analyze on a clip by clip basis for right now. Now, chances are what's going to happen is that when you open the source settings window, it's going to open up into color encoding. Now you're going to notice lots of tabs, lots of windows, lots of things you might not understand. Don't worry. By the time we're done this, you're going to completely understand this. All I want to talk about right now is FrameFlex. Now, what's actually kind of great about this, and I like this, is you'll notice that when I go from color encoding to FrameFlex, things kind of get squashed down and weird stuff starts happening, which is actually super handy. All right. So the FrameFlex window is broken down into 3 parts. This represents the clip that we've selected in the bin. All right. This represents what is happening with the frame in our timeline. And this is a visual representation of both. This represents the actual FrameFlex, and this represents what our timeline is seeing. Now, if you want to just pick a different, I actually kind of like where I parked it here, just because our I'm not going to call him a BMX. He's like a motocross rider, is basically right in front of the camera, which is good. Now, you'll notice up here, this is fine, giving us information that we need to know. It's basically 3072, 1620. This is really the most important thing here, 1.90 to 1, because it's not going to match what our timeline is. We know that our timeline is 16:9, or to be honest, really should be called 1.78 to 1 to match, you know, sort of the way everything else is laid out in here. But you'll see it's called 16:9 for simplicity and for basically people that are new to aspect ratios and new to Media Composer. So what I'm going to do is I want to say, fine, you be what you are. But what I want Media Composer to do is to conform to its frame aspect ratio of 16:9 of the project. And once I do that, I want you to watch what happens over here. Two things are going to happen. Immediately, you'll notice that the frame size switches, and you'll notice the image changed down here. Now, why is that? Okay. Why that is because right here, this is representing our image being squashed down and being stretched out to sit on the four corners of our frame in 16:9, which we don't want to do. We want to say, okay, let's bring the image down to match it vertically, but horizontally what I want you to do is just crop the image off in a 16:9 aspect. Okay? Now, the concept works the same if you were doing like a 1-to-1. Now, again, this is what the timeline has seen, so don't worry about that. But you'll see the FrameFlex window here is now showing me a square frame. Now, if my timeline had a square frame, it would show that to me here, okay? But you see what's happening with the 16:9. What's now happened is image has been brought down to fit vertically, is being cropped horizontally. Okay, now, there may be some situations where you don't want to do that. Maybe all you care about is, you know what? Let's just letterbox our footage. So we get a little bar here at the top. We make it fit horizontally, and we're just going to letterbox it vertically. No problem. You'll notice down here in reformat, it's by default set to stretch. Well, you could change that to be pillar box or letterbox, and now you'll see a little letterbox appears. If you know you just want to crop it off, you don't care, you could just say center crop. Okay? For me, I leave it as stretch, and I adjust the FrameFlex aspect ratio to be that matching my timeline. Perfect. Okay? At this point, this shot is now what I call correct. Okay? I'm going to say apply. I'm going to say OK. What I'm now going to do is I'm actually going to select the other three clips because as you'll notice they have different raster dimensions, which is fine. Because what I want to do is because they all have this and this all matches each other, I'm more confident coming in and saying, okay, let's go to our source settings. Let's not worry about anything that's happening here. Let's only worry about this matching our project. Okay? I'm going to apply it to all. I'm going to say OK. And now if you take a look, that FrameFlex window has now been put in here properly for our 16:9 frame. Now, I did, when I got in here and did this, show you that it actually created the window, and I said that we had some spare footage around the outside. But I didn't actually say what you could and couldn't do with FrameFlex. What you do have the ability to do, depending on the aspect of your footage, is I could now reframe this if I want. So for example, if I wanted a little bit more space here in front of this front wheel, I can actually take the FrameFlex window. What I'm going to do here is I'm just going to bring the window out of the way here a little bit, okay? Is I'm going to take this window, I'm just going to drag it over here to the right a little bit, and you'll notice it immediately adjusts here. Now, what I should do is do it like this. There we go, okay? So when I say apply, you're going to see it update right here, okay? Or I could bring it back the other way. You'll notice it immediately adjusts here if I want him a little bit closer to the edge. Now, keep in mind, we do have the ability to adjust this after the fact in our timeline that we will talk about once we start talking about editing, because I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. But I just want to show you that, let's say hypothetically, a little boom mic was sticking in the frame on the edge over here and we didn't want to see it. And, you know, hypothetically, if this was sitting in the middle, and let's say the boom was sticking in right here, I could just slide this out of the way. So every time I use this shot, I don't see that boom. Okay. Now again, what's important to keep in mind is that you'll notice that nothing has adjusted in my bin until I actually say apply. And as soon as I do that, boom, it now matches what's happening down here. Okay. Now again, here's the thing. You can be as general, you can be as specific about this as you want. You could be like, you know what, I don't care. I'm just going to leave this all centered. I'll come and adjust it after the fact. Maybe, like I said, there's a boom mic that's sticking in every shot. You want to make a slight adjustment to it. Boom, move it over. Boom, move it over. Now, we're going to talk more in-depth, complex FrameFlex concepts later on, but I want to introduce this idea to you because it's important to understand because you might be dealing with some, crazy raster dimension or aspect ratio and your footage is looking all weird in your Media Composer timeline. This is what will fix it. All right, I think that's a good place to leave off with FrameFlex. We've now gotten in and established how we're going to make sure that the footage that we're bringing in, no matter what aspect ratio, no matter what raster dimension, is going to work inside of our timeline. In our next lesson, we're going to talk about color encoding. Now, what is color encoding? Color encoding is getting in and making sure that our footage looks the way that we need it to look before we actually get in and transcode it. All right, so keep that in mind. All right, now, if you like this lesson, please do me a favor and like, subscribe, and share it across your social media channels, because we want to try to get the word out there to as many people as we can about learning Media Composer. And I think this lesson is another one like consolidating and transcoding that's important that you know, so that all your footage looks correct in your timelines. And don't forget that if you have any questions, you can feel free to post them in the comment section down below, or you can send me an email at kevinpmcauliffe@gmail.com.